The airport buzzed with activity, a symphony of hurried footsteps, distant announcements crackling through speakers, and the faint hum of airplanes in motion. Amidst the crowd stood Margaret Maggie Turner, a dignified, elderly black woman with soft gray curls peeking beneath her modest Sunday hat. Her pearl necklace rested delicately against the collar of her gray dress, a quiet testament to her grace and timeless style. Clutching her worn leather handbag tightly, Maggie took a deep breath as she approached the boarding gate. It had been decades since she last flew, and the mere thought of being thousands of feet in the air made her palms damp. But this trip was too important to let fear win. Her great-grandchildren were waiting for her on the other side of this flight, bright-eyed, full of stories, and eager to meet the woman they only knew through video calls and holiday cards. "First time flying, ma'am?" A young man in a navy blue airline uniform asked with a kind smile. Maggie returned the smile, her eyes twinkling. "Not the first time, young man, but it's been a mighty long while. Longer than you've been alive, I reckon." They shared a brief laugh before Maggie made her way onto the plane. As she shuffled down the narrow aisle, her handbag bumping lightly against the seats, Maggie's eyes scanned for her seat number. The plane felt both vast and suffocating, a strange juxtaposition that made her heartbeat quicken. A sharp voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, you'll need to stow your bag quickly, please. You're holding up the line." Maggie looked up to see Kara Bennett, a slender flight attendant with perfectly pinned blonde hair and a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Maggie hesitated, fumbling with her handbag. Before the silence grew awkward, a voice from behind spoke up. "Let me help you with that, ma'am." A middle-aged man in a plaid button-up shirt stepped forward, gently taking Maggie's bag and placing it into the overhead compartment. "There you go. All set," he said with a nod. Maggie's shoulders visibly relaxed. "Thank you, son. That was very kind of you." The man smiled warmly before moving to his own seat, while Kara turned sharply on her heel and walked briskly down the aisle. Settling into her window seat, Maggie let out a slow breath. She pressed her hands together and whispered a short prayer, her lips barely moving. "Lord, give me peace and patience for this journey." The engine rumbled to life beneath her feet, and outside the window the sky stretched endlessly, a boundless sea of clouds waiting to embrace her. The hum of the engines intensified as the plane began to taxi. Maggie closed her eyes briefly, clutching the armrest as the world tilted back and gravity pressed her into her seat. Her chest tightened, but she reminded herself of the faces waiting for her at the other end of this flight, the small hands that would wrap around her neck, the laughter that would echo in her ears. When the plane leveled out in the sky, Maggie finally exhaled. She glanced around at the other passengers, business travelers glued to their laptops, a mother shushing her restless toddler, an elderly couple holding hands as they looked out the window together. Each person had their own story, their own destination, but for a few hours they were all in this metal bird together, suspended between heaven and earth. Kara passed by again, her expression unreadable. Maggie offered her a polite smile, but it wasn't returned. Instead, Kara's gaze lingered for a moment too long before she turned away. Maggie's fingers fidgeted with the hem of her dress as a knot of unease formed in her stomach. She couldn't quite place why, but something about that look unsettled her. Still, she reminded herself why she was here. Love had brought her onto this plane, and love would carry her safely to her family. With that thought, she turned her gaze back to the sky outside the window, where the clouds stretched out like an endless quilt of white. The journey had just begun. The plane soared steadily through the sky, a silver arrow slicing through a blanket of cotton clouds. Margaret Maggie Turner shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting gently on her lap. The faint hum of the engines blended with the occasional cough, whispered conversations, and the soft chime of the flight attendant call button. She glanced at the small window, marveling at the endless expanse of blue stretching beyond the glass. It was a view she hadn't seen in decades, a fleeting reminder of how vast and beautiful the world could be. Yet, despite the wonder before her, a subtle unease lingered in her chest, like a faint shadow that refused to disappear. The aisle bustled with movement as Kara Bennett, the flight attendant from earlier, made her way down with a beverage cart. Her polished uniform was immaculate, her smile tight and precise, but her eyes were cold, void of warmth or kindness. "Would you like something to drink?" Kara's voice was clipped as she stopped beside Maggie's row. "Yes, dear. Just a cup of water, please," Maggie replied softly, her voice carrying the gentle weight of someone used to speaking with care. Kara hesitated for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over the stack of plastic cups. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she poured water into a cup and handed it to Maggie without looking at her. "Here," she said curtly before moving to the next row. Maggie accepted the cup with trembling fingers. She wasn't someone easily unsettled, but there was something sharp and unspoken in Kara's tone, a subtle hostility that cut deeper than words. Across the aisle, a young mother with a fussy toddler caught Maggie's eye and offered her a small smile. Maggie smiled back, her lips trembling slightly before she took a sip of water. Time passed slowly as the plane continued its journey. Passengers settled into their routines, some sleeping, others scrolling through their phones or watching in-flight entertainment. Maggie pulled out a small, creased photograph from her handbag. It showed her great-grandchildren. Two little faces beaming with uncontainable joy, their eyes bright with innocence. "Hold on, Maggie," she whispered to herself. "You're almost there." But peace was fleeting. Kara returned to the aisle again, her presence sharp and unyielding. She stopped beside Maggie's row and leaned slightly over the armrest. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the correct seat? This section doesn't seem right." Maggie looked up, her brows knitting together in confusion. "I believe this is 12A, isn't it? That's what's on my ticket." Kara straightened, her expression icy. "Just making sure. It's important everyone's in their proper place." Before Maggie could respond, Kara turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, their murmurs barely audible over the steady hum of the engines. A man seated 2 rows ahead craned his neck to look back at Maggie, offering her a small nod of support. A middle-aged woman in the same row gave Maggie an apologetic look, her lips pressed tightly together. Maggie's chest felt heavy, her hands clutching her cup of water. She had always believed in giving people grace, in seeing the good even when it was buried deep beneath layers of bitterness. But Kara's tone, her pointed glances, it felt intentional, it felt personal. Her mind began to race. Did I do something wrong? Was I in someone's way? Did I offend her somehow? But deep down, she knew. It wasn't about what she had done, it was about who she was. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight transitioned into its cruising phase. Maggie closed her eyes briefly, taking slow, deliberate breaths. The voices of her late husband and her children echoed in her mind, reminding her of the strength she carried within her. "Don't let anyone steal your peace, Maggie girl," her husband would say whenever life's burdens grew heavy. When she opened her eyes again, her resolve was steady. She wouldn't let this woman's cruelty ruin her journey. She wouldn't let it tarnish the precious moments waiting for her on the other side of this flight. But despite her strength, the chill from Kara's words lingered in the air, seeping into Maggie's bones like an unwelcome draft. Across the aisle, the mother with the toddler gave Maggie another gentle smile. It was small, but it was enough, a flicker of warmth in an otherwise cold space. The journey was far from over, and Maggie knew she had to hold on. The cabin had settled into a subdued calm, broken only by the faint hum of the engines and the occasional cough or rustle of paper. Overhead lights glowed dimly, casting soft halos over the passengers. Margaret Maggie Turner sat quietly in her window seat, her hands gently folded in her lap, her pearl necklace glinting faintly in the low light. She glanced briefly across the aisle. The young mother who had smiled at her earlier was now rocking her toddler to sleep, the little boy's head nestled against her chest. Nearby, other passengers were either engrossed in their screens or dozing off, heads resting awkwardly against the seatbacks. But despite the stillness of the cabin, an unease lingered in the air, a tension like an invisible thread pulling tighter with each passing moment. Kara Bennett reappeared, walking briskly down the aisle with a clipboard in hand, her heels clicking sharply against the carpeted floor. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was like a sudden chill sweeping through the cabin. She stopped abruptly at Maggie's row, her eyes narrowing slightly. Ma'am, are you sure you're okay here? You've been awfully quiet. Maggie looked up slowly, her gentle brown eyes meeting Kara's icy blue ones. Her voice was soft but steady. I'm fine, dear. Just enjoying the flight. Kara's lips curved into a tight, humorless smile. Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. Her words dripped with something unspoken, a sharp edge hidden beneath professional politeness. As Kara moved on, Maggie's shoulders slumped slightly. Her breath came out in a quiet sigh, her chest heavy with a weight she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just Kara's words, it was the way she spoke them, the fleeting glances, the dismissiveness, the subtle but unmistakable disrespect. From a few rows back, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a plaid shirt had been watching. He leaned forward slightly, his brows furrowed. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly to the young flight attendant who followed Kara, a woman with auburn hair and kind hazel eyes. "Everything all right up there? That lady doesn't seem to be causing any trouble." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Sarah, glanced toward Maggie and then back to the man. "She's perfectly fine, sir. I'm sorry if anything seems out of place." Sarah's voice was warm and genuine, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as they followed Kara's retreating figure. Maggie caught the interaction out of the corner of her eye and felt a small warmth bloom in her chest. Kindness, even in small doses, was a powerful balm. But Kara wasn't finished. As the beverage service concluded, Kara returned down the aisle with sharp, deliberate steps. This time she stopped abruptly beside Maggie's seat, her voice just low enough that only Maggie and a few nearby passengers could hear. "Ma'am, are you sure you're supposed to be in this section? These seats are usually reserved for higher-paying customers." A hush fell over the nearby rows as heads turned slightly, passengers pretending not to listen but failing miserably. Maggie's eyes welled slightly, but she blinked the tears away before they could fall. Her voice, though soft, carried an undeniable strength. "My ticket says 12A, Miss Bennett. I'm right where I'm supposed to be." A murmur rippled through the passengers nearby. A woman 2 rows back, wearing a blue cardigan, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The man in the plaid shirt shook his head slightly, his jaw tightening. Kara straightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down something inevitable. The silence left in her wake was suffocating. Maggie looked out the window again, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. A proud, dignified woman who had seen decades of life, both its beauty and its cruelty. Her heart ached, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small, to feel unwelcome, to feel less than. From across the aisle, the mother with the toddler caught Maggie's eye again. She mouthed 2 words silently, "I'm sorry." Maggie offered her a small, reassuring smile in return. Nearby, Sarah, the kind flight attendant, paused briefly as she walked past Maggie's row. She didn't say anything, but she offered Maggie a quick, knowing look, a silent apology, a fleeting acknowledgement that what was happening wasn't right. It was a moment of humanity in an otherwise cold space. As the plane continued to glide through the night sky, Maggie folded her hands in her lap once more and closed her eyes, whispering a quiet prayer. "Lord, help me keep my peace. Help me carry myself with grace, even when the world feels heavy." But despite her quiet strength, the weight of Kara's words lingered in the cabin like smoke, unseen but impossible to ignore. The airplane cabin, though dimly lit, felt charged with an unspoken tension. Conversations had quieted, screens flickered in the darkness, and yet an invisible spotlight seemed to hover over Margaret Maggie Turner. She remained in her seat, her back straight, her chin lifted ever so slightly, a quiet defiance against the heavy air around her. Her fingers clutched the hem of her dress, knuckles pale with effort. But her face remained composed, a mosaic of grace and quiet endurance. Outside her window, the moon hung low, casting a silvery glow over the clouds below. Kara Bennett's sharp voice cut through the hushed atmosphere once again. This time, she was louder, her tone carrying an edge of irritation as she addressed another passenger about seatbelt safety. The mother across the aisle, still gently rocking her toddler, avoided Kara's gaze as she passed. A ripple of unease followed the flight attendant wherever she walked, like the faint echo of a storm just beyond the horizon. It wasn't just "Excuse me, Miss Bennett," a voice called out softly but firmly. It was the man in the plaid shirt, his brows knitted together in concern. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Kara turned sharply, her professional smile plastered back into place. "Of course, sir. Is there a problem?" The man lowered his voice but made no effort to hide the firmness in his tone. "I couldn't help but notice how you've been treating that lady over there. She hasn't done anything wrong, yet you keep singling her out." Kara's lips twitched, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sir, I assure you, I'm simply doing my job." "No," he interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "You're not. You're targeting her, and we can all see it." For a brief moment, Kara seemed caught off guard. Her posture stiffened, and her polished facade cracked just slightly before she turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the front of the plane. The man leaned back in his seat with a heavy sigh, exchanging a brief glance with Maggie. He gave her a small nod, an unspoken gesture that said, "I see you. I'm with you." Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. She could feel her heart beating heavily in her chest, but her face remained calm. Years of life had taught her to carry herself with dignity, even in moments of humiliation. Maggie wagry minutes passed, though they felt stretched thin over an eternity. Then Kara returned, her voice sharp as she leaned over Maggie's row. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you to move. We've received a concern about your seat assignment." Gasps rippled across nearby passengers. The mother across the aisle shook her head, her toddler now asleep against her shoulder. The man in plaid muttered something under his breath. Maggie lifted her chin, her voice trembling only slightly as she spoke. "My ticket says 12A, Miss Bennett. I have every right to sit here." But Kara was already reaching over, gesturing for Maggie to gather her things. "Please, ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be." At that moment, Sarah, the other flight attendant with auburn hair and hazel eyes, appeared beside Kara, her face tight with conflict. "Kara, perhaps we should." Kara cut her off sharply. "Sarah, I have this under control." Passengers were watching now, some horrified, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Maggie could feel their eyes on her, their silence pressing down like a weight on her shoulders. Oh, felt it now. It was everyone. Slowly, with trembling hands, Maggie began to gather her belongings. Her handbag, her small carry-on, the worn photo of her great-grandchildren, all clutched tightly as if they might somehow anchor her to something steady. Sarah stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. Please let me help you." But Maggie shook her head gently. "No, dear, I can manage." She stood, her frail frame still carrying the weight of dignity, still radiating the quiet strength of someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side unbroken. As she turned to walk down the aisle, a voice rang out, sharp and clear. "This isn't right." It was the man in plaid, his face flushed with anger. "You can't do this to her. She hasn't done anything wrong." Another passenger chimed in, a woman with silver hair and tired eyes. "She deserves better than this." One by one, voices rose in protest, some loud, others soft, but all echoing the same sentiment. The mother across the aisle whispered a shaky, "I'm so sorry." But Maggie didn't turn back. She walked slowly down the aisle, clutching her handbag and her dignity close to her chest. Her heels clicked softly against the carpet, a faint sound swallowed by the rising chorus of discontent behind her. Sarah followed closely, her eyes brimming with tears. At the front of the cabin, Maggie paused briefly. She turned to look back down the aisle, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had spoken up for her, the ones who had broken the silence. She gave them a soft, trembling smile. Then she stepped off the plane. The silence that followed her departure was profound, a heavy blanket that smothered even the hum of the engines. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shame, anger, and helplessness. Kara stood at the front, her face pale but unreadable. Sarah had disappeared toward the cockpit, her shoulders shaking as she quietly cried out of view. Somewhere in the airport below, Margaret Maggie Turner walked away from the gate, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. She whispered softly to herself, "Lord, help them see, help them know better, and help me forgive." The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. The terminal was a sea of movement, suitcases rolling, voices echoing over loudspeakers, and weary travelers checking their phones for updates. But amidst the chaos, Margaret Maggie Turner walked with deliberate steps, her head held high despite the tremor in her hands and the ache in her chest. Her modest gray dress fluttered slightly with every step, and her pearl necklace shimmered faintly under the fluorescent lights. She found an empty bench near a large window overlooking the tarmac and sat down, her handbag resting gently on her lap. Outside, planes taxied and lifted into the sky, each one carrying people with their own destinations, their own stories. Maggie closed her eyes briefly, her breath shaky as she whispered another quiet prayer. Lord, help me carry this burden with grace. Help me find the strength to move forward. Back on the plane, the tension was suffocating. The passengers sat in silence, their faces etched with unease. Kara Bennett stood near the front, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was avoiding eye contact, her jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if it might shatter. Sarah, the kind flight attendant with auburn hair, emerged from the cockpit, her eyes red-rimmed from tears she had been holding back. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "I'd like to apologize for what just happened. What you witnessed it was not right." Her words hung in the air, fragile and raw. The man in the plaid shirt shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The mother with the sleeping toddler bit her lip, her eyes glistening. The older woman in the blue cardigan shook her head slowly, her expression a mix of sadness and anger. Sarah turned toward Kara, her voice firmer now. "Kara, this isn't acceptable. That woman, Mrs. Turner, deserved better. She deserved kindness and respect, just like every passenger on this flight." Kara's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to respond, but no words came out. Her face flushed a deep red as she turned and disappeared behind the curtains separating the galley from the cabin. Meanwhile, in the airport lounge, Maggie sat quietly, her hands gently folded over her handbag. A young airport employee in a crisp uniform approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am?" "Mrs. Turner?" he said softly. Maggie looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting his. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for what happened on that flight," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "That shouldn't have happened. It was wrong." Maggie gave him a small smile, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Thank you, son. It means a lot to hear that." The young man hesitated, then nodded before walking away, his shoulders slumped. Maggie could see the weight he carried. The weight of witnessing injustice and feeling powerless to stop it. But Maggie wasn't powerless. In another part of the airport, far removed from Maggie, Kara sat alone in a small break room. Her hands trembled as she clutched a cup of coffee, her perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, a woman who had built her identity on control, precision, and authority. But now, cracks were beginning to form in the polished veneer she had worn for so long. Sarah entered the break room quietly, her expression filled with exhaustion and disappointment. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she sat across from Kara and let the silence stretch between them. "Kara," Sarah finally said, her voice soft but steady, "you need to understand what happened back there. It wasn't just a bad moment or a lapse in judgment. It was wrong. It was hurtful. And it's not something we can just ignore." Kara's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back fiercely. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know what came over me." Sarah sighed deeply, her shoulders sagging. "Sometimes, Kara, it's not about what we meant to do. It's about what we did, and what you did today hurt someone deeply. Someone who didn't deserve it." The weight of Sarah's words settled over Kara like a stone. She looked away, her shoulders trembling slightly. Back in the terminal, Maggie's phone buzzed in her handbag. She pulled it out slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she answered. "Mom?" came the voice on the other end. It was James Turner, her son, her rock, the man who had built a life out of hard work and determination. "James," Maggie said softly, her voice cracking just slightly. "Mom, I just got a call. I heard what happened." His voice was tight with controlled anger. "Are you okay? Are you safe?" "I'm fine, son," Maggie replied gently. "I'm fine." But James wasn't convinced. "This isn't right, Mom. I'm gonna make some calls. I'm gonna fix this." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "James, don't let anger guide you. Promise me you'll handle this with the same grace your father always carried. Promise me." On the other end of the line, James exhaled slowly. I promise, Mom, but I'm not letting this go. Not this time. As the call ended, Maggie sat back on the bench, her hands trembling slightly. But deep within her, a spark remained, a flicker of hope that something good might still come from all of this. In the sky above, the plane carried its passengers to their final destination. Conversations continued in hushed tones, eyes exchanged silent glances, and hearts carried the weight of what they had witnessed. But in that weight, a seed had been planted, a seed of awareness, of accountability, and perhaps of change. The glow of James Turner's office was muted by the late hour. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city skyline, where distant lights flickered like scattered stars. Papers were neatly stacked on his mahogany desk, and framed photos of his family, his wife, his 2 daughters, and his mother, Margaret Maggie Turner, lined the shelves. James stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear. His tall frame was rigid, his jaw clenched as he listened to a trembling voice on the other end of the line. Mr. Turner, I'm deeply sorry for what happened to your mother, said the airline's regional manager, his voice cracking with nervous energy. We're launching an internal investigation as we speak, and I assure you we'll get to the bottom of this. James closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a slow breath. His voice when he spoke was measured but firm. This isn't just about my mother, Mr. Pierce. This is about every passenger who's been treated unfairly and walked away in silence. I expect a full report by morning, and I expect accountability. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. The call ended with a soft click. James set the phone down carefully, but his hands trembled slightly. His mind raced, images of his mother sitting alone in that terminal, clutching her handbag, her dignity intact but her spirit bruised. His assistant, Carla, appeared at the doorway, clutching a tablet and a notepad. She was sharp, efficient, and had worked beside James for years. Sir, the news is already spreading, she said softly, her brows furrowed. Passengers from that flight have started sharing their experiences online. It's gaining traction. James turned away from the window, his eyes sharp with focus. Good, let it spread. The world needs to see this. Carla hesitated before speaking again. Your mother, she's still at the airport. Would you like me to arrange transportation for her? James's shoulders sagged slightly. No, Carla, I'm going to get her myself. Back at the airport, Maggie remained seated on the same bench, her handbag still resting on her lap. The terminal had quieted as the night wore on. A few travelers dozed in chairs, their bags piled beside them. The distant murmur of an intercom announcement echoed faintly across the empty concourse. Sarah, the kind flight attendant from earlier, approached cautiously, her hazel eyes filled with remorse. She was out of uniform now, her auburn hair falling loosely around her shoulders. Mrs. Turner? Sarah's voice was soft, almost timid. Maggie looked up, her face calm but her eyes tired. Hello, dear. Sarah hesitated before speaking. I wanted to tell you how sorry I am for what happened. It wasn't right. You didn't deserve that. Maggie studied the young woman for a moment before offering a small smile. Thank you for saying that, child. It takes courage to face something that's wrong. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I tried to stop her. I really did, but She paused, choking on her words. Maggie reached out and gently patted Sarah's hand. Sometimes, dear, doing the right thing feels like standing in a storm, but even small acts of kindness can change someone's world. Sarah nodded, blinking back her tears. I just wanted you to know, I'll speak up next time. I won't stay silent. Maggie gave her hand a gentle squeeze. That's all anyone can ask. Outside the airport, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. James stepped out, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement as he adjusted his suit jacket. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. He walked quickly through the glass doors of the terminal, his eyes scanning the empty rows of chairs until he spotted her. His mother, sitting quietly near the window. Mom? He said softly as he approached. Maggie looked up, her face lighting up with relief and love. James. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that their silence couldn't convey. I'm so sorry, Mom. James whispered finally, his voice cracking. I should have been there. I should have protected you from this. Maggie shook her head gently. James, you've always protected me. But some burdens aren't meant for others to carry. This one was mine, and I carried it as best as I could. James swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. This isn't over, Mom. I'm going to make sure no one else ever feels the way you felt today. I promise you. Maggie smiled softly, her tired eyes shining with pride. I know you will, son. He helped her to her feet, one arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders as they walked out of the terminal together. The night was still and cold, but the weight on Maggie's chest felt a little lighter with her son beside her. Back in the airline's headquarters, emails began flooding inboxes. Passengers had started posting photos and videos from the flight, Kara's sharp words, Maggie's quiet dignity, and the murmurs of protest that had rippled through the cabin. The airline's public relations team scrambled to control the narrative, but the story was already out in the world. The face of an elderly black woman with warm brown eyes and a pearl necklace became a symbol, a reminder of the quiet strength carried by those who face indignity with grace. In her office, Kara sat staring at her phone screen, reading the headlines that now bore her name. Her hands shook as she realized the weight of what she'd done, the damage she'd caused, not just to her career, but to another person's spirit. And across the city skyline, James sat in the back seat of the sedan with his mother's hand clasped tightly in his own. Mom, James said quietly, this is just the beginning. We're going to make this right. Maggie nodded slowly, her voice soft but certain. We will, son, we will. As the car disappeared into the night, the seeds of change had been planted. And somewhere deep in the soil of injustice, something new was beginning to grow. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline, casting warm golden light over Aurora Air's corporate headquarters. Inside his corner office, James Turner stood near the window, his hands shoved into his pockets, his brows furrowed in deep thought. Behind him, his assistant Carla moved efficiently, setting down a fresh cup of coffee and laying out a stack of printed reports. Mr. Turner, Carla said softly, breaking the silence, the preliminary investigation is complete. It's not good. James turned, his jaw tight. Go on. Carla hesitated for just a moment before speaking. Passenger accounts corroborate everything. Video footage from passengers shows clear hostility from Kara Bennett. Some of the clips are already viral. The backlash is growing, and it's not just online, it's in the news. There are calls for accountability, for transparency. James exhaled sharply, his shoulders sinking slightly. And Kara? Carla glanced down at her tablet. She's been suspended pending further investigation, but the damage is done, sir. The public is watching. James nodded, his expression grim but resolute. Good, let them watch. If we're going to fix this, we're going to do it openly. No sweeping this under the rug. Carla hesitated again. There's one more thing. Your mother, Mrs. Turner, she's been asked to speak publicly. Journalists are reaching out. They want to hear her side. James's heart ached at the thought. His mother had already been through so much, yet now the world wanted to place her under a microscope. She doesn't owe anyone an explanation, Carla. Not after what she's endured. Carla nodded, her voice soft. Understood, sir. But, knowing Mrs. Turner, I think she might want to speak. Not out of anger, but out of hope. Across town, Maggie Turner sat in her cozy living room, a steaming cup of tea resting on the small side table beside her. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, bathing the room in a soft glow. The walls were adorned with family photos, snapshots of birthdays, graduations, and quiet Sunday afternoons. She sat in her favorite armchair, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, her mind heavy with thoughts. The phone had been ringing all morning. Reporters, friends, strangers who had seen the viral videos and wanted to share their support or ask questions. But Maggie had let them all go to voicemail. The weight of it all pressed against her chest. She had spent a lifetime carrying herself with dignity, teaching her children and grandchildren about kindness, about standing tall even when the world tried to push them down. And now her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible, to feel small. A soft knock at the door broke her from her thoughts. Come in, she called out. James stepped into the room, his suit jacket draped over one arm, his eyes weary but filled with love. Morning, Mom, he said softly. Morning, son. Maggie gestured to the couch across from her. Sit down, James. You look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders. James smiled faintly as he lowered himself onto the couch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. "They want you to speak," James finally said, his voice careful. "The media, the public, they want to hear from you." Maggie nodded slowly. "I know. You don't have to do this, Mom. You don't owe them anything." Maggie set her mug down carefully and looked at her son, her eyes calm but firm. "James, this isn't just about me anymore. What happened on that plane wasn't just my burden to carry. It was a reflection of something much larger, and if my voice can help bring change, then I'll use it." James's eyes glistened slightly as he nodded. "Okay, Mom, but you won't be alone. I'll be right there beside you." Maggie reached across the table and placed her hand over her son's. "I know you will, son." At Aurora Air's headquarters, Kara Bennett sat alone in a sterile conference room. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was now loose around her shoulders. The crisp lines of her uniform felt suffocating, the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest. The door creaked open and Sarah stepped inside, her hazel eyes cautious but kind. The next day, Maggie stood in front of a podium at a press conference organized by Aurora Air. James stood slightly behind her, his presence solid and unwavering. Cameras flashed, journalists murmured, and the world waited. Maggie stepped forward, her hands steady on the sides of the podium. "Good morning," she began softly, her voice carrying a warmth that cut through the tension in the room. "My name is Margaret Turner, and I am many things: a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother. But above all, I am a human being. And every human being deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." The room was silent, every ear tuned to her words. What happened to me on that flight wasn't just about me, it was about a culture, a mindset that needs to change. But I am not here to point fingers or to dwell in anger. I am here because I believe in hope. I believe in change. And I believe that we can all do better if we are willing to listen and learn. She paused, letting her words settle. To those who supported me on that flight, to the passengers who spoke up, to the staff who showed kindness, I thank you. And to those who have the power to create change, I urge you, do not let this moment pass without action. Maggie stepped back, her face calm and her posture steady. James placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his eyes shining with pride. The applause started slowly, then built into something powerful, a collective acknowledgement of Maggie's grace, her strength, and her unwavering dignity. In that moment, it wasn't just about one woman on one flight. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And somewhere in the crowd, Kara Bennett watched with tears streaming down her face, knowing that her journey toward redemption had only just begun. The press conference had ended, but its echo lingered far beyond the sterile walls of the Aurora Air headquarters. Margaret Maggie Turner's words had transcended the event. They rippled through television screens, social media feeds, and radio broadcasts. Across the nation, people listened, nodded, and felt something stir deep within them. A shared understanding of injustice, a recognition of quiet dignity, and a longing for change. In her modest home, Maggie sat by the window, her teacup cradled gently in her hands. Outside, children played under the glow of the afternoon sun, their laughter ringing through the air. She watched them with a small smile on her face, but her heart felt heavy, not with sadness, but with the weight of responsibility. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. Another email, another voice reaching out, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of discrimination and resilience. Maggie picked up the phone and read one message in particular. "Dear Mrs. Turner, I watched your press conference today with my teenage daughter. We both cried listening to your words. Thank you for reminding us that kindness and courage still matter. You've inspired us to do better. With gratitude, Rebecca and Lily." Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words wash over her. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the Rebeccas and Lilies out there. All the people who were watching, learning, and deciding to stand up, even if their voices shook. At Aurora Air's headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted. The usually polished hallways buzzed with murmurs, and meetings were held behind closed doors. James Turner sat at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by board members, HR representatives, and legal advisors. James, one of the senior board members, began, his voice cautious. "We've received hundreds of complaints about Kara Bennett's behavior. Not just from this flight, but from past incidents as well. Passengers, colleagues, there's a pattern here. James leaned forward, his hands clasped together. Then we act on it, immediately. Another board member spoke up. We can't afford to just make this about Kara, though. This incident exposed deeper issues within our company culture. If we only focus on her, we're ignoring the root of the problem. James nodded slowly, his expression serious. You're right, this isn't just about one person. It's about the environment we've allowed to grow. And it stops today. He stood, his voice steady as he addressed the room. Effective immediately, Aurora Air will launch a company-wide diversity and inclusion initiative. Every employee, from the top down, will go through mandatory training, and we're establishing an independent ethics committee to ensure accountability going forward. There was a brief silence before one of the younger board members spoke softly. It's about time. James turned to Carla, who stood quietly at the side of the room. Carla, I want Mrs. Turner's voice to be part of this initiative. If she's willing, I'd like her to help guide us. Her wisdom, her grace, it's exactly what we need. Carla nodded firmly. I'll reach out to her today. At the same time, Kara Bennett sat in a sparsely furnished office, waiting. Her suspension had been in effect for days, and each hour felt heavier than the last. She stared at the clock on the wall, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When the door opened, it was Sarah who stepped inside. She carried a folder and wore an expression that was equal parts stern and compassionate. Kara, Sarah began carefully, the company has made its decision. Kara swallowed hard, bracing herself. You're being terminated, effective immediately. Kara's face crumpled as tears began to spill down her cheeks. But Sarah didn't stop there. The company isn't stopping at just letting you go, Kara. They're changing things. Policies, training, it's all going to be different now. Because of what happened. Because of you. Because of Mrs. Turner. Kara wiped at her face with trembling hands. I'm so ashamed, Sarah. I don't know how to fix this. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. Sometimes, Kara, fixing something starts with admitting we broke it. Have you reached out to her? To Mrs. Turner? Kara shook her head, her voice breaking. I don't even know where to start. Sarah set a small handwritten note on the desk. It was Maggie Turner's address. Start here. Later that evening, Maggie sat on her porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow across the sky. The chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic painted the soundscape of a quiet neighborhood evening. A figure approached hesitantly from the sidewalk, a familiar figure with tired eyes and slumped shoulders. Kara Bennett, Maggie said softly as the woman stepped onto the porch. Kara froze, clutching a small envelope in her hand. Mrs. Turner, Her voice broke, and tears began streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I can't tell you how sorry I am. Maggie looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Child, forgiveness is not something I can hand to you like a wrapped gift. It's something you'll have to earn, something you'll have to live into every day. Kara nodded, her shoulders shaking. I'll try. I'll do better. Maggie gestured to an empty rocking chair beside her. Sit down, Kara. Let's talk. And there, under the fading light of dusk, two women sat together. One carrying the weight of her mistakes, the other carrying the grace to guide her toward redemption. In the weeks that followed, Aurora Air began its transformation. Training sessions filled boardrooms, diversity initiatives became action plans, and accountability became more than just a word in a mission statement. And at the heart of it all was Maggie Turner, a woman with a pearl necklace and an unyielding spirit, whose quiet dignity had sparked a wildfire of change. But Maggie didn't seek recognition or applause. Her joy came from knowing that perhaps, in some small way, the world was becoming a little kinder, a little more just. As she sat in her rocking chair one warm evening, her phone buzzed with a text from James. Mom, you did it. You really did it. Maggie smiled, her heart full, her spirit light. The morning sun filtered through the glass walls of Aurora Air's conference room, casting golden hues across the polished mahogany table. Outside, planes taxied on the runway, their engines humming like distant thunder. Inside, James Turner stood at the head of the room, addressing a group of airline executives, senior staff, and representatives from the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Behind him, a large screen displayed the words, Aurora Air, a commitment to dignity, respect, and change. Today marks a new beginning for Aurora Air. James began, his voice steady and resolute. The events of the past weeks have forced us to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about one incident, but about the culture we've allowed to persist. This isn't about damage control or public relations. This is about building something better, something real. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. We owe this transformation to every passenger who steps onto one of our flights. But most of all, we owe it to one extraordinary woman who reminded us of what true grace looks like. My mother, Margaret Turner. A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the room as Maggie's photo appeared on the screen. Her warm smile, her pearl necklace, her quiet dignity radiating even in stillness. Meanwhile, across town, Maggie Turner sat in her sunlit living room. A laptop rested on a small side table, where a virtual meeting with Aurora Air's committee was about to begin. Her hands, steady despite her age, adjusted the camera as her face appeared on the screen. "Good morning, Mrs. Turner," Carla greeted her warmly. "Thank you so much for being here with us today." Maggie nodded, her voice calm and composed. "Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here." The meeting unfolded with purpose. Maggie spoke softly but firmly, sharing her perspective, her hopes, and her vision for what Aurora Air could become, not just as an airline, but as an example for others. You can change policies, you can rewrite handbooks, but real change happens in the hearts of people, Maggie said, her voice carrying weight beyond the digital screen. You have to create an environment where respect isn't just expected, it's instinctive. And that begins with how you treat the people in front of you, whether they're a passenger, a coworker, or someone who looks different from you. Her words settled like stones in water, creating ripples that would extend far beyond the walls of the meeting. Elsewhere, Kara Bennett stood outside Maggie's home, clutching a bouquet of white lilies. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her breath unsteady. It had taken her weeks to gather the courage to return, to face the woman she had wronged. The door creaked open, and Maggie appeared, her expression calm, her eyes soft yet piercing. "Kara," Maggie said softly. "Mrs. Turner," Kara's voice cracked as she held out the bouquet with trembling hands. I needed to come here, to look you in the eye and tell you that I'm sorry, truly sorry." Maggie accepted the flowers, her fingers grazing Kara's hand. For a moment, there was silence, a silence heavy with regret, humility, and the fragile hope of redemption. "Come sit, child," Maggie said, stepping aside to let Kara in. They sat together in the small, cozy living room. Kara's shoulders shook as she spoke haltingly, confessing her mistakes, her blindness to her own prejudice, and her fear of being judged forever by that one moment. "I don't expect forgiveness, Mrs. Turner," Kara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." Maggie studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Forgiveness isn't earned, Kara, it's given. And it's not just for you, it's for me too. So that I can let go of this weight and move forward." Tears rolled down Kara's cheeks as she nodded, her breath catching in her throat. In that quiet room, amidst the scent of lilies and the warmth of the morning sun, something fragile and profound began to heal. Back at Aurora Air, the changes were no longer confined to boardrooms or virtual meetings. They were taking root in every corner of the airline. Flight attendants gathered for new training sessions, airport staff engaged in open conversations about inclusivity, and passengers began to notice small but meaningful differences in how they were treated. Sarah, the auburn-haired flight attendant, now served as a diversity ambassador for Aurora Air. Her voice carried weight, her kindness now a visible example for others. In an employee break room, Sarah spoke to a group of new recruits. "It's not enough to follow procedures. You have to lead with your heart. Every passenger you meet carries a story, and how you treat them becomes part of that story." The recruits nodded, some taking notes, others looking up with quiet determination. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie sat on her porch with James beside her. Fireflies blinked in the warm summer air, and the world felt calm, if only for a moment. "You know, James," Maggie said softly, "this isn't just about one flight or one airline. It's about how we treat each other every day, in big ways and in small ways." James nodded, his voice heavy with emotion. "You've changed so many lives, Mom, including mine." Maggie smiled, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. Change doesn't always come in loud moments, son. Sometimes it starts with a whisper, a quiet stand, and sometimes it starts with a seat on a plane. They sat together in silence, their hearts full, their spirits light. In airports across the country, passengers walked down jet bridges with a renewed sense of trust. Flight attendants greeted them with smiles that reached their eyes. And somewhere, on a flight bound for another corner of the world, an elderly woman wearing a pearl necklace took her seat by a window. She looked out at the endless sky stretching before her and whispered a quiet prayer. Lord, let every journey, big or small, be filled with kindness. The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane lifted into the sky, carrying with it not just passengers but a promise of dignity, respect, and hope. The sky above the airport was painted in soft hues of lavender and gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. A gentle breeze carried the faint scent of jet fuel and freshly brewed coffee from nearby kiosks. The terminal bustled with the usual rhythm of departures and arrivals, yet there was an undeniable shift in the air, a quiet transformation, a hum of change that pulsed through every interaction, every exchanged smile. Margaret Maggie Turner stood near Gate 12A, clutching her worn leather handbag. Her pearl necklace glimmered softly under the fluorescent lights. Her eyes, though tired, sparkled with a light that came from something deeper than happiness, something closer to peace. Mrs. Turner, a voice called out gently. Sarah, the auburn-haired flight attendant, approached with a warm smile. She was no longer just a face in a uniform. She was now a leader in Aurora Air's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Her badge glinted with the words, Change Ambassador. It's an honor to see you again, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Maggie smiled and reached out to gently clasp Sarah's hand. The honor is mine, child. You've done well. Nearby, passengers milled about, some glancing toward Maggie with recognition. Her face had become synonymous with courage, her name a quiet anthem for dignity. Inside Aurora Air's headquarters, James Turner stood at a podium in a packed auditorium. Employees, pilots, flight attendants, administrative staff, and maintenance crews filled the seats, their faces turned upward with anticipation. Today marks not just a milestone for Aurora Air, but a promise. A promise to every passenger, every employee, and every person who walks through our gates. James began. His voice was steady, but the emotion behind his words was palpable. We have learned, we have listened, and we will continue to grow. But none of this would have been possible without one woman, my mother, Margaret Turner. A massive screen behind him displayed Maggie's photo, her gentle smile, her unmistakable poise. The audience erupted in applause, some wiping away tears as they clapped. James paused, letting the moment settle. Her strength reminded us that leadership isn't about titles or power. It's about how we treat others. It's about leading with kindness, with integrity, and with humility. Back at Gate 12A, Kara Bennett stood a few feet away from Maggie, clutching a small journal against her chest. Her once sharp and confident demeanor had softened. Her shoulders no longer carried the weight of defensiveness, but instead the quiet burden of self-awareness. Mrs. Turner, Kara said, her voice trembling. Maggie turned and met Kara's gaze. For a brief moment, the bustling terminal faded away, and it was just the two of them, two women standing on either side of a bridge built from grace and redemption. I've been attending the workshops, Kara began hesitantly. I've been listening, learning, and changing. And I wanted you to know that I'll never stop trying to do better. Maggie studied her for a long moment before stepping forward and placing her hands gently on Kara's shoulders. Child, Maggie said softly, what matters isn't where you've been, it's where you're going. And it sounds to me like you're walking in the right direction. Kara's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. Maggie pulled her into a gentle embrace, and in that moment, the weight they both carried seemed to lighten. Months passed, and the changes at Aurora Air became tangible. Passengers noticed the difference in how they were welcomed on board, how their concerns were handled, and how every member of the staff carried themselves with a renewed sense of purpose. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee, with Sarah at its helm, rolled out nationwide training programs that became a benchmark for the entire airline industry. But Maggie Turner's impact reached far beyond Aurora Air. Her story became part of educational materials in schools, where children learned about courage, dignity, and the power of speaking up. Universities invited her to speak at events focused on social justice and leadership. And in homes across the nation, families discussed her name around dinner tables, her story a reminder that change often begins in the quietest moments. One warm summer afternoon, Maggie sat in her rocking chair on her porch, watching her great-grandchildren chase each other across the lawn. James sat beside her, his sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, and his eyes bright with pride. "Mom," he said softly, "do you realize how many lives you've touched, how many hearts you've changed?" Maggie chuckled lightly, her pearl necklace catching the light of the setting sun. "James, all I did was sit in my seat. The rest was up to everyone else." James smiled and shook his head. "No, Mom, you didn't just sit. You showed the world what dignity looks like when it's tested. And because of you, people are standing taller, speaking louder, and loving harder." Maggie closed her eyes briefly, letting the moment wash over her. When she opened them again, she looked out at the horizon, her heart full. "You know, James," she said softly, "I think the world still has a long way to go, but it's walking in the right direction now." James reached over and squeezed his mother's hand. "Because of you, Mom?" The sky turned shades of orange and pink as the day faded into night. The sounds of laughter filled the air, and for a brief, perfect moment, everything felt still, whole, and at peace. Epilogue. At an airport far away, a young black woman stepped onto a plane, her shoulders square, her eyes bright with confidence. A flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile, her voice kind, her gaze steady. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. We're so glad you're here." The woman smiled and took her seat, gazing out the window as the plane prepared for takeoff. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly before her, a canvas of hope, painted with the colors of every story, every voice, and every quiet act of courage that had brought her here. And somewhere, in the whispers of the wind, was the faint echo of Margaret Turner's voice. "Lord, let every journey, big or small, be filled with kindness."